particular topic, we are welcoming to our 3 questions maximum. Any questions?
Who wants to ask it?
Any questions? Any want to more some new things? Any queries?
I'll do.
Yeah.
Just for the sake of,
Yeah.
Why don't you take a position, both the alternatives that you have, and tell us exactly where do you stand? You have given two positions, one the German response and one the Vedantin's response. Where do you stand and why?
Because I am thinking from philosophical point of view. And Advaita Vedantin says region cannot help you to attain the reality or absolute. You will have to surrender to the Shruti. And I haven't read that, so why would I go for it? So K. Sachidanand Murthy is saying, you can achieve the moksha or liberation through region. I'm trying to expose that position that region is not eligible to attain that particular realm or particular reality. For that you will have to take the help of Shruti. That is the classical response of Advaitins. That is why I am not actually answering or taking any particular position. So Kant exposes Advaitins like K. Sachidanand Murthy, who's arguing that region can help us to attain the absolute, and scholars like K.C. Bhattacharya is exposing Kant that there is a realm that can be attained, but for that one will have to take the shelter of Shrutis. But I again says region stops at certain level at dialectic, but Kant moves towards axiology, towards morality and aesthetics at the same level. Advaita Vedanta moves towards soteriology. These are the two alternative ways which I have traced out, that both tradition stops at one level, that is of region, we are at the level of dialectic, but the ways are totally different. Kant goes towards axiology and Advaita Vedanta goes towards soteriology. This is the thing. Thank you.
Thank you.
In mind. Yeah.
Yeah.
We are running too late.
Yes,
Next
yes.
session. Yeah.
Yes. Any other session? First of all, sorry for inconvenience. I would like to introduce myself, Dr. Chintala from Gautam Buddha University, head of the Department Buddhist Studies. I would like to few marks, but I am not a specialization in the Kant. I am specialization in the Buddhist. So I would like to make few points. Kant and Buddhism, particularly from some of the comparative concepts related to ethics, selfhood, and human freedom. So here, the ethical foundations, the duty and compassion, how the Buddha and Kant, how they make the similarity and the rejection of the both the things, vice versa. Second, the nature of self, anatomy and the not self, how they both contradict as well as similarities. The limits of knowledge and epistemology. I would like to make some of the important. I would like to make the points which was time is not permit to me. Otherwise, I would like to share on that.
2 minutes.
Finally,
Professor, 2 minutes.
Yeah.
2
Thank
minutes.
you, Professor
No,
Nadraj,
we
giving me
overshot
for
time.
that. Yeah, freedom and liberation. Thank you, Professor Nadraj. So here, the Kant ethical philosophy particularly is grounded in the principle, the finally ethics, duty, and compassion. So it is very warm on the forms of reason. The Kant reasonal effect as well as the Buddhist epistemology almost the similarity. Second, I would like to make it the nature of self and anatomy as well as the non-self, how both are accepted. The Kant, the moral system presupposes the rational agent of the capable of the autonomy. At the same time, self is not just an empirical object, but is a transcendental condition for the moral responsibility. So this is the Kantian aspect. From the Buddhist point of view, ethical life is requires insight into the emptiness of selfhood. So the liberation arises out of from the offering of autonomy as well as ego-centered attachment. So both have some. And Kant emphasize the respect of person. Buddhism emphasize compassion for all the beings, not only the human beings. including animals, creatures which are acting in the universe. The critique of egoism, both the traditions diagnose self-centered, desire and moral destructive. At the same time, ethical discipline both are followed. Finally, freedom requires training and whether rational or contemplative, but that is a limitation of dogmatism. So this is what I observation. This is a great opportunity for me to share that. Finally, I do make the conclusion. Both the Kant and Buddhism represent the two profound victims of human moral life, particularly Kant construction, the philosophy of rational autonomy grounded in the universal law, but Buddhism proposes the path of liberation grounded inside into suffering and non-self. So this is the real transformation between both the thinkers. Finally, the global philosophy integration, the reason and awareness, duty, compassion, and autonomy, interdependence, both are accepted. So this is my small remarks apart from the Kant as well as Buddhism. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I sincerely thank our chair and both the speakers for such enriching presentations. I request Professor Shivasai to present certificates to both the speakers. Oh. So we'll move on to the next session now. We are privileged to have our next session chaired by Professor Bhaskarjit Neog. Professor Neog teaches at the Center for Philosophy, Jawaharlal Nehru University. His areas of specialization include social ontology, ethical theory, and applied ethics, with broader competence in moral and political philosophy, philosophy of mind and action, and philosophy of religion. Professor Neog completed his PhD from IIT Kanpur and has held several prestigious academic fellowships, including the Endeavour Postdoctoral Research Fellowship in Australia. He is the author of the book What Responsibility, Whose Responsibility, Intention, Agency, and Emotions of Collective Entities, published by Routledge in 2023. Professor Neog serves on editorial boards of reputed journals, as well as ethics committees of leading academic institutions. We welcome you, sir. We are equally honored to have two distinguished speakers joining this session. Firstly, we have Professor Apaar Kumar, who teaches philosophy at the Humanities and Languages Division, School of Arts and Sciences at Ahmedabad University. Professor Kumar's core areas of specialization include the history of modern philosophy, especially Kant, hermeneutics and phenomenology, and ethics. His broader academic competence extends to early modern philosophy, 19th and 20th century German philosophy, continental philosophy, and political philosophy. His research projects explore historically informed reconstruction of Kant's theory of self-consciousness, and within its larger scope engages with questions at the interface of philosophical hermeneutics and social ontology in conversation with the work of Husserl, Heidegger, and Gadamer. Professor Kumar has taught a variety of undergraduate and graduate programs in the history of philosophy, hermeneutics, phenomenology, ethics, and Kant, and has published several articles in esteemed journals. We invite you, sir. Also joining us, we have Professor Meghant, who is currently teaching in the Department of Philosophy at Boise State University. His academic formation reflects a strong foundation in both the sciences and humanities. He earned a BSc in chemistry from St. Stephen's College, New Delhi, followed by an MA in philosophy from University of Delhi and a PhD in philosophy from State University of New York at Stony Brook, where his doctoral research focused on matter and motion in Kant's philosophy of science. His areas of research interest include Kant's metaphysics and epistemology, 19th century continental philosophy, and the history of modern philosophy. He teaches courses ranging from introductory philosophy to specialized topics such as the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. In addition to his primary appointment, Professor Sudan has held visiting position at Concordia University, Montreal, and contributes actively to ongoing philosophical discussions through his research and teaching. We welcome you, sir. So without further delay, I now hand over the proceedings to our chair, Professor Neog. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Vaishnavi. Very good morning to you all. Welcome to this second session of the day 2. I think this is technically first session, but effectively it's the second session of the day 2 of this amazing Kant conference. It's been a pleasure listening to some of these talks. But as the day progresses, I'm sure things are going to get much better as we have some fantastic talks lined up. First, we have today in this session, first I should thank Nataraju and Smita for having me as the chair of this very interesting session, perhaps the most well thought out session of the day so far. And this is especially, particularly I'm happy about it because this is an entirely undiluted moral philosophical package. We have with us two foremost Kant scholars of my generation, Apaar and Meghant, coming from two different intellectual traditions, if I may say so, continental philosophy and analytic philosophy. They're going to be engaging two very interesting and interconnected themes in Kant's moral philosophy: lying and respect, self-respect. First, I think we'll start with lying and then move on to examine how lying undermines self-respect, if I may put it in that way as a general remark. Apaar is going to be engaged in the phenomena of lying. He's going to take a position vis-a-vis Christine Korsgaard, and Meghant in turn will take up the issue of respect with the help of a bunch of important Kantian themes like autonomy, dignity, admiration, and the like. So first we'll start with Akar's presentation, and I would request you to keep the presentation within first 45 minutes. We have 2 hours. It's a 2-hour session. And with these words, let's begin. The floor is yours. Thanks.
Yeah. So, first of all, thanks to the organizers, to Smita and Professor Nataraju, for inviting me to this wonderful conference at JNU. A couple of remarks before I start. One is that what I'm presenting today is a kind of an excerpt from a much longer paper on Korsgaard and lying, this topic. Some of the things that I've included in the abstract, so some of the premises that I've included in the abstract are not some things that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about other premises to support my argument. The second thing is I do have slides, and I will hopefully, sort of keep shifting them in time. But I mean, it's just a kind of aid. I've just summarized some of the quotes of the arguments, so it might actually help because in some slides, the whole argument has been summarized. So it might help, but I think I'm primarily reading the essay today. So Kant says that a maxim of action is moral only if it is in line with the categorical imperative. And I quote, act only in accordance, act only, wait, this is not working. Yeah, that's okay, but I mean, that needs to work, no? Oh, I can just, but then where will I put my stuff? There's no space here. Yeah, okay. Sorry, I'm going to start again. Yeah. Kant says that a maxim of action is moral only if it is in line with the categorical imperative. Quote, act only in accordance with the maxim that you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. End of quote. Now, lying violates the categorical imperative. Therefore, for Kant, it is always immoral to lie. It's gone off. Can I just, then maybe perhaps if it's not working, I'll just read it out.
It's a loose connection.
No problem. I just talked about the categorical imperative, and lying is sort of it violates the categorical imperative, and so for Kant, it is always immoral to lie. As is well known, Benjamin Constant proposed a thought experiment to challenge Kant's rigorous claim that one should never lie. This thought experiment, as Kant takes it, can be expressed as follows. If someone intent on murdering your friend F stands at the door of your house and compels you to answer the question, is F present in the house? With either yes or no, would you truthfully say that F is indeed in your house or lie in a bid to prevent F's murder? Right. So henceforth, I'm just going to call this particular case the murderer case. So would you lie in a bid to prevent or save your friend's life or prevent F's murder? While many of us might think it best to lie in such a scenario, Kant infamously argues that it would be wrong to lie to the murderer, given that the duty to lie, given that the duty to truth, quote unquote, in essence, allows for no exceptions. So Kant says, even in a case like this, you should never lie, right? In her influential essay, The Right to Lie, Kant on Dealing with Evil, Christian Korsgaard, like several others, including Kant interpreters, rejects Kant's counterintuitive response to the murderer case. Korsgaard argues that Kant's rigoristic denial of lying does not come from a, quote, misplaced love of consistency or legalistic thinking, but from an attractive ideals of human relations, which is the basis of his ethical system, end of quote. Yet Korsgaard says that Kant is wrong in his response to the murderer case because, quote, morality itself sometimes allows or even requires us to do something that from the ideal perspective is wrong, end of quote. This fact that morality itself permits exceptions to moral oughts does not, for Korsgaard, quote unquote, impugn Kant's moral philosophy as an ideal system, but merely means that Kant's ethical system, quote, needs special principles to deal with evil, end of quote. To remedy this lack, Korsgaard outlines what she calls a double-level theory to supplement Kant's ethical system such that exceptions to the moral imperative may be permitted in non-ideal or evil contexts, right? So she basically articulates her own theory in which, in evil contexts, you can sort of have exceptions to the moral imperative. So here's my argument. In this presentation, I argue that some of Korsgaard's central criticisms of Kant in The Right to Lie require further justification because these criticisms are either premised on a problematic interpretation of some of Kant's claims or neglect key passages, in some cases entire arguments, from Kant's writings. This does not, of course, entail that Kant's response to the murderer case is useless in a general philosophical sense or that it is not Kantian in some measure. But it does mean that her argument in The Right to Lie is of limited value if the goal is to reconstruct in its most charitable form Kant's arguments for why one ought not to lie to the murderer at the door. In what follows, I argue, and the argument is sort of impressive on the slide now, in what follows, I argue against two of Korsgaard's criticisms of Kant in The Right to Lie. I first raised doubts regarding Korsgaard's main claim in RL, or Right to Lie, that lying can be universalized from within the Kantian system. So she basically says that lying can be universalized from within the Kantian system. Kant says that lying is always prohibited because it violates the categorical imperative, that is, its universalization leads to contradiction. Focusing on a particular formulation of the categorical imperative, usually referred to as the formula of the universal law, FUL, Korsgaard interprets the notion of contradiction in FUL as practical contradiction, right? So her interpretation of FUL or contradiction in the categorical imperative is a practical contradiction. On this basis, she contends that lying in the murderer case can be universalized from within the Kantian system and so can be permissible. I argue, however, that this conclusion, that is the claim that lying can be universalized from within the Kantian system, is unwarranted, because Korsgaard's practical contradiction interpretation, 1, takes the nature of contradiction in the hypothetical imperative to be of the same sort as the nature of the contradiction in the categorical imperative. And 2, her argument relies on the notion of efficacy to explicate the categorical imperative in a way that seems un-Kantian. Right? That's the first argument. Second argument, I argue against Korsgaard's criticism that Kant's ethical theory is powerless. And I quote, she says that Kant's ethical theory is quote unquote powerless in the face of evil. And I will challenge that particular proposition. So I'll begin with, the first argument, Korsgaard's claim that lying can be universalized from within Kant's own ethical system. I'll start with Korsgaard's view and then point to some difficulties in this view. So Korsgaard argues or claims, or rather she accepts Kant's claim that maxims of lying are violations of perfect duty and cannot be conceived without contradiction when universalized. That is, such maxims violate the categorical imperative. However, she argues that contra Kant, quote, we may lie to the murderer in Constant's thought experiment, end of quote, if we interpret the notion of contradiction involved in the CI as a practical contradiction. So what is a practical contradiction? Korsgaard argues that it is quote unquote reasonable to think that the sort of contradiction involved in the hypothetical imperative, henceforth HI, is the sort of contradiction involved in the categorical imperative, henceforth CI. Hypothetical imperatives, Korsgaard says, are analytic because, quote, someone who wills an end knows that it will be brought about by a certain necessary and available means, has no extraneous reasons not to use that means, and yet is utterly unmoved to take it, is irrational in a way that seems to amount to contradiction, end of quote. In other words, if you conceive of yourself as a quote, cause of the end, then you must rationally initiate a causal chain that is, by definition, the means that will result in the production of the end. For instance, if your end is to get dinner, you must walk to the fridge, and so on. So, your, quote, willing the end contains, or insofar as you are rational, is already willing the means, end of quote. And it is this containment relation that makes actions violating the hypothetical imperative contradictory. For Korsgaard, quote, this gives us a sense of practical contradiction, of contradiction in the will, which is different from, but not weaker than theoretical contradiction. So practical contradiction, she says it's as strong as theoretical contradiction, right? Because if you end and, if you have an end and you don't will the means for that, that's just contradictory. It's a practical contradiction. Having specified the sort of contradiction implied by the analyticity of the hypothetical imperative, Korsgaard says that, quote, it is reasonable to think that this will be the sort, so the sort of contradiction involved in the hypothetical imperative will be the sort of contradiction in the categorical imperative. She provides an interpretation of contradiction in CI, specifically this formula of the universal law, FUL, as a quote, practical contradiction that is based primarily on philosophical considerations, end of quote, because she thinks that, quote, no interpretation of contradiction vis-a-vis FUL can be based on textual considerations alone. So basically she's saying that, you can't really, the text doesn't give us anything really about what contradiction means in FUL or in the CI. So the only way to do it, the only way to understand it is through my notion of practical contradiction, right? On this interpretation, which Korsgaard calls the practical, she calls it, it's a long name, the name for her interpretation, practical contradiction interpretation of the contradiction conception test. So I'm just going to call it a PCI test, right? The contradiction involved in the universalization of an immoral maxim is that the agent would be unable to act on the maxim in a world in which it were universalized so as to achieve his own purpose. That is the purpose that is specified in the maxim, end of quote. In other words, quote, in willing the world of the universalized maxim, and Kant says, at the same time willing the maxim itself, the man wills the frustration of his own end, end of quote. That's what practical contradiction is for At least formally, that's what practical contradiction is for the Corsgaard. It will become more clearer what this means once we apply it to the lying case, right? And so that's what we do next, right? Practical contradiction and lying. Now, Korsgaard argues, and this is the key claim, the Korsgaard argues that lying is impermissible if we apply the PCI-based test, or her interpretation, if we apply the PCI test to the murderer case. But it may be permitted if we apply it to a reimagined version of this case. So if we apply it to the Kant's version of the murderer case, then of course lying is still immoral. But if we apply it to a reimagined version of this case, which is her own reimagination, right? Reimagined version of her case, as it were, then you actually have a situation in which lying could be permitted. So Korsgaard first applies the PCI test to lying in general. Lying, she says, cannot be universalized in most cases without contradiction, given that, quote, lies are usually efficacious in achieving their purposes because they deceive. But if they were universally practiced, they would not deceive, end of quote. Thus, the universalization of the maxim of lying would, quote, contradict itself because the efficacy of lying as a method for achieving its purpose would be undermined by its universal practice. So if everyone lies, your lying is not going to be effective, right? However, for Korsgaard, Kant is, quote, wrong in thinking that it is never all right to lie. It is permissible to lie to deceivers in order to counteract the intended results of their deceptions. For the maxim of lying to a deceiver is universalizable. So you can actually lie to a deceiver because that's something that can be universalizable, right? The deceiver has, so to speak, placed himself in a morally unprotected position by his own deception. He has created a situation which universalization cannot reach. Korsgaard argues that lying is impermissible if we apply the PCI-based test to the murderer case, but she thinks that it may be permitted if we apply it to the reimagined version of this particular case, right? So here's the reimagined version of this case. In the murderer case, Korsgaard says lying cannot be universalized because if it were a universal fact that everyone would lie to the murderer, then the murderer, included in the everyone, would be aware of the fact and would not be deceived by your answer. This means that the universalization of the lie would make lying to the murderer inefficacious. That is, lying to the murderer would be immoral on the PCI test. So if the murderer, so the idea is that lying cannot be universalized if you think of Kant's version of the murderer case, because if it was a universal fact that everyone would lie to the murderer in such a situation, then the murderer, who's also included in the everyone, would know that fact and so would not believe your lie in any case, which means that your lie would not be efficacious. However, and here's the slide now, in the reimagined version of the murderer case, in which the murderer, quote, who expects to conduct his business by asking questions, supposes falsely that you do not know who he is and what he has in mind, it may be permitted to lie to the murderer, because in this instance, your lie would be, quote, efficacious even as practiced universally, right? So if the murderer comes to the door and doesn't tell you that he's a murderer, in this case, your lying can actually be universally efficacious. That's the claim, right? This is because in the reimagined case, the murderer would not, deceptively, according to Korsgaard, tell you of his evil intentions. For this reason, the murderer would assume that you do not know that you are speaking to a would-be murderer, and he would not, quote, conclude from the fact that people in such circumstances always lie, that you will lie, end of quote. This entails that the murderer would believe your lie, that is, your lie would be efficacious. This in turn means that there is at least one situation in which it would be moral to lie to the murderer if we accept Korsgaard's PCI test. In this way, Korsgaard concludes that it may be considered moral to lie to, quote, deceivers, it may be moral to lie to deceivers to counteract the intended results of their deception, and that lying can be universalized on her version of the murderer case, although not on Kant's version of the murderer case. So she changes the game, as it were. She changes the case, and then she says, well, here's a case in which lying can be universalized, and so lying is going to be permitted or moral. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make some arguments against the claim that line can be universalized from within the Kantian system. Right? So Korsgaard argues that line can be universalized from within Kant's own moral system if we interpret contradiction vis-a-vis the categorical imperative as a practical contradiction. I've said this. However, as I now argue, Korsgaard's contention here can be disputed because it is based on the contentious claims that, one, it is reasonable to think that the sort of contradiction in the categorical imperative, henceforth CCI, is the sort of contradiction implied by the analyticity of the hypothetical imperative, CHI. And that's the first point. So I'm going to say she basically extrapolates from contradiction in the HI to contradiction in the CI. I'm saying that's problematic, right? And the second claim that I'm going to make is that she uses the notion of efficacy to understand CCI in a way that almost seems un-Kantian. Therefore, Korsgaard has not shown, at least as it stands, that line can be universalized from within the Kantian system. So first point. Korsgaard claims that it is reasonable to think that CCI and CHI are of the same sort. However, I now show that CCI and CHI can be considered constitutively different for Kant because causality and temporality must necessarily be presupposed in CHI but plays no role in CCI. So causality and temporality, they have to be presupposed in CHI but play no role in CCI. So that's a huge difference, right? And Korsgaard just does not take that into account when she extrapolates from CHI to CCI, right? She just thinks that the contradiction in the hypothetical imperative is the same sort of contradiction in the categorical imperative. Kant says that the categorical imperative, or CI, is not at all hypothetical. And this is from the groundwork. The hypothetical imperative, or HI, quote, commands not absolutely, but only as a means to a further purpose, end of quote. That is, HI-based action has its source in a projected end. In contrast, the CI is not, quote, concerned with the material of action and that which is supposed to follow from it, that is the end of the purpose, but the form and the principle out of which it itself follows. And its essential goodness, the essential goodness of the CI, consists in the disposition. The word is Gesinnung, right? The disposition. The consequences may be whatever they might be, right? End of quote. This is again from the groundwork. This means that CI-based action is unconcerned with the content or material of the action and does not aim at achieving an end. So there is the HI, when you're working with the HI, it's always about achievement of an end. With CI, it's about a disposition of the mind, as it were. And it's never about achieving a particular end. Rather, the action in relation to CI is done in accordance with a disposition, presumably a mental disposition, irrespective of the consequences or that it might produce, irrespective of the ends. So the projected ends are not at issue at CI, but they are everything in the case of HI. This claim that the source of HI-based action is the projected end and the source of CI-based action is a mental disposition presupposes a more fundamental divergence between CCI and CHI for the following reasons. First, causality is necessarily required to explain CHI. So causality is necessarily required to explain the CHI, but need not play a role in explaining CCI. Right? So causality is the main point in CHI, but not the issue with CCI. Since it is directed towards a projected end, HI-based action can be viewed as a cause necessary to reach this end. For instance, if your end is to get dinner, you must take the causal steps needed to get dinner. E.g., you might need to walk to the fridge. CHI results if you will the end of getting dinner, but irrationally refuse to take the causal steps required for fulfilling this end. However, it is at least prima facie plausible to argue that causality forms no part of an explanation of CCI, because Kant can be said to conceive of CCI in purely logical terms in his response to Constant and also in the groundwork. Now, there's a huge debate around this thing, but here's the interpretation, which I'm also arguing for in another paper, which I think is going to be a good critique of Korsgaard. So in his response to Constant, Kant says that when one tells a lie, one makes oneself, quote, an exception with respect to a rule which is incapable of exception according to its essence because it directly contradicts itself in the exception. End of quote. This is from his response to Constant. In this passage, contradiction can be said to be conceptualized not in causal terms, but purely logical terms. So unlike the HI where it's with CCHI and HI where it's always in terms of causality, in this claim or this passage, it seems that when you sort of conceptualize CCI, it's going to be purely in logical terms and not in causal terms, right? So the claim, so in this passage, contradiction can be said to be conceptualized not in causal, but in purely logical terms. The claim seems to be, if X, a person X, is a human and asserts the proposition, no human is a human that is allowed to tell a lie under any circumstance. So that's the one proposition X makes. No one is supposed to lie under any circumstance. And if X affirms that, if X affirms at the same time, some human is a human that is allowed to lie. So basically, if X says at the same time, no SSP and some SSP, right? No one should lie and someone should lie, right? That's if X does that or sort of asserts both these propositions at the same time, then X is contradicting herself. Similarly, in the groundwork, Kant says that the will is absolutely good, whose maxim, if it is made into a universal law, can never conflict itself, right? Here too, as in his response to Constant, Kant is characterizing CCI in purely logical terms, but because he says that an immoral action or immoral maxim is self-contradictory, even though he uses the term Widerstreit or conflict rather than Widerspruch, which is contradiction. Thus, CCI can be thought to be a purely logical contradiction, entirely detached from causality, while causality is built into the very structure of the CHI. But if this is the case, then Korsgaard needs to show why such a significant difference between CCI and CHI would not vitiate her claim that CCI and CHI are of the same sort. So basically, I've argued that, because CHI has causality and CCI does not have causality, then they're obviously different. So then Korsgaard has to give us an account for why you can extrapolate or infer from CHI to CCI, right? That's the claim. Second, temporality must play a necessary role in accounting for CHI, but need not play a role in the explanation of CCI. The end to be attained is a constitutive feature of HI-based action. If I will an end at T1, I must take the first causal step at time T2 and continue to take further causal steps if I want to reach the end at time T3. This implies that CHI must occur across temporal moments. So there has to be a temporal stretch for CHI to occur. For instance, if I were to will the end at T1, then CHI would arise at T2. If it did not, if I will the end at T1, then CHI would arise at T2 if I did not take the first causal step towards the end at T2. CI-based action, on the other hand, is grounded in a mental disposition and is not directed towards an end to be attained. So if I act in accordance with the CI at time T1, I did not take time T2 or any other subsequent moment of time into account. This implies that CCI does not require T2 at all. So, I mean, you can't have CHI if there's no temporal stretch, but there is no temporal stretch when you talk about CCI. Now, if CHI requires a temporal stretch, while CCI does not, then CHI and CCI could be considered different, which contradicts Kant's claim or Korsgaard's claim that it is reasonable to think of CCI as the same sort as the CHI. Hence, since CCI and CHI differ in terms of their relationship to causality and time, Korsgaard's claim that CHI and CCI are of the same sort requires further justification. Now, the second argument against the claim that lying can be universalized from within the Kantian system, again, sort of critiquing his. Of course, she makes that claim because she presumes a notion of practical contradiction. But I am basically now going to challenge her reading of CCI as a practical contradiction. So Korsgaard employs the criterion of efficacy to interpret CCI. However, such an interpretation requires further support for the following reasons. First, Kant explicitly denies that CCI can be explained in efficacy terms. So it's absolutely clear that efficacy is not the point for Kant, right? Second, Korsgaard's efficacy interpretation contains an unsubstantiated presupposition that efficacy is in some sense prior to rationality, or at least forms the core of rationality, right? So this efficacy interpretation is, first of all, it's un-Kantian, and then even if you accept that interpretation, that will lead to consequences that will be un-Kantian, right? So Korsgaard says, and I quote, "What the PCI test shows to be forbidden are just those actions whose efficacy in achieving their purposes depends upon their being exceptional. If the action no longer works as a way of achieving the purpose in question when it is universalized, then it is an action of this kind." End of quote. In this passage, Korsgaard conceptualizes the categorical imperative test in terms of the notion of efficacy. I'm going to just call it the efficacy test now. The maxim of an action is moral if it retains the efficacy to achieve its purpose when it is universalized. Right? However, the maxim of an action is immoral if it cannot efficaciously achieve its purpose upon universalization. Right? This is because an immoral maxim contains, quote, practical contradiction, because the agent adopting that maxim would be unable to act on the maxim in a world in which it were universalized so as to achieve his own purpose, that is the purpose that is specified in the maxim. That's just Korsgaard. Thus, Korsgaard interprets the categorical imperative test as an efficacy test and CCI as a practical contradiction. However, Korsgaard's interpretation of CCI in efficacy terms requires further justification for the following reasons. So now my argument. First, Korsgaard uses the notion of efficacy to interpret CCI, and the fact that she uses efficacy to interpret CCI is inconsistent with Kant's claim, which he makes repeatedly throughout his career, that the CI is not to be explained in terms of purposes, that is an end to be attained. In the Critique of Practical Reason, Kant says that if one is telling someone never to make, quote, a lying promise, then one is providing him with a rule which concerns merely his will, irrespective of whether his purposes, Absichten, may be achieved or not, end of quote. And if this rule is, he says, correct, then it is a law because it is a categorical imperative. So practical laws, Kant is saying, alone relate to the will, regardless of what is carried out through the causality of the will, and one can abstract from the causality as belonging to the world of sense to get to the pure laws. Similarly, in the groundwork, he says, quote, "The categorical imperative gives the action without relation to any intent," Absicht again, end of quote. Finally, in the Metaphysics of Morals, he says that the CI makes an action, quote, "objectively necessary, not through the representation of a purpose," Zweck is the word now, "that can be achieved by an action, but through the mere representation of this action itself according to its form," end of quote. In these passages, Kant entirely separates the CI from any yet to be attained end or purpose. So it is odd that Korsgaard interprets CCI in efficacy terms, given that the notion of efficacy in the efficacy test relates to an end to be attained. Korsgaard's argument is basically as follows. It can be reconstructed in the following way. You act on an immoral maxim, that is, you tell a lie, because you expect this action to effect an end for you. So you lie so that it's somehow effective for you, right? That is, fulfill one of your purposes. You lie to fulfill some particular purpose that you might have. But if you universalize this maxim, that is, apply the CI test, you would find yourself in a situation in which your action, that is lying, would not fulfill your purpose. And this, according to Korsgaard, is contradictory in a practical sense because the action done to achieve your end fails to achieve your end. The problem with this argument is that Korsgaard's very use of the notion of the end to be attained to interpret CCI is inconsistent with Kant's view that CCI and CI have nothing to do with the end to be attained. So the end to be attained is just not an issue for CCI and CI. Thus, it is uncertain that Korsgaard's efficacy test is a Kant-sensitive interpretation of CI and CCI. So it's not a Kant-sensitive interpretation at all, right? Second, Korsgaard's explanation of the CI test as an efficacy test tacitly assumes that efficacy is in some sense prior to rationality. or at least forms the essential feature of rationality. Since Korsgaard does not argue for this assumption, her interpretation of CCI in efficacy terms is, as it stands, unconvincing. On Korsgaard's efficacy test, this means end structure, which Kant associates with the HI, is used to understand the workings of the CI. Korsgaard says, quote, in the world of the universalized maxim, the hypothetical imperative from which the false promiser, that is someone who acts on an immoral maxim, constructs his maxim is no longer true, end of quote. Korsgaard's claim here entails that a person X would not act on a maxim that fails the CI test because the maxim would not have the beneficial consequence that X seeks if the maxim were universalized, which in turn implies that X's pursuit of beneficial consequence that ultimately leads to her to reject the immoral maxim. So in a sense, I'm saying that the fact that she's using efficacy means that she's somehow working with a notion of a beneficial consequence, right? That is almost prior to any kind of rationality, right? So let me just read this again once more, maybe slower. Korsgaard's claim here entails that a person X would not act on a maxim that fails the CI test because the maxim would not have the beneficial consequence that X seeks if the maxim were universalized, which in turn implies that it is X's pursuit of beneficial consequence that ultimately leads her to reject immoral maxims. Now for Kant, quote, all moral concepts have their seat and origin completely a priori in reason, end of quote. This is from the groundwork. And he conceives of the CI as an a priori rational test to demarcate moral from immoral actions or maxims, right? Therefore, if it is true that the rational CI test turns on the presumption of a principle of beneficial consequence, as Korsgaard seems to think, then Korsgaard must show that this principle has explanatory priority over a priori reason, or at least forms the core feature of a priori reason. Core feature of a priori reason if her efficacy test interpretation of CI or CCI is to be remotely in line with Kant's conceptualization of the CI and CCI. This task is especially important because according to Kant, the CI is valid for all rational beings and cannot be derived from special characteristics of human beings. If it turns out that the principle of beneficial consequence is implicit in Korsgaard's interpretation of CI and CCI, and that essentially constitutes a priori reason, and if it's also the case that which constitutes beneficial consequence is that which constitutes beneficial consequence is human-centric, then CI would not be valid for all rational beings, which would seriously violate the Kantian system. I think, let me just read the last line again. If it turns out that the principle of beneficial consequence implicit in Korsgaard's interpretation of CI and CCI essentially constitutes a priori reason, and if that which constitutes beneficial consequence is human-centric, then the CI would not be valid for all rational beings, which would seriously violate the Kantian system. So in sum, and that's the argument there, Korsgaard says that lying can be universalized from within Kant's own system if we read CCI as practical contradiction, but I've argued that Korsgaard's notion of practical contradiction need not be taken to be the correct interpretation of CCI, because it is neither reasonable to think that CCI and CHI are of the same sort, nor can the notion of efficacy be used to understand CCI. Therefore, Korsgaard's criticism that lying can be universalized from within the Kantian system requires further justification. Now, the second argument, she basically says that Kant's ethics is powerless in the face of evil, and I'm going to say, well, that doesn't seem right? So here's the quote. Korsgaard says, quote, one of the great difficulties with Kant's moral philosophy is that it seems to imply that our moral obligations leave us powerless in the face of evil. Kant's theory sets a high ideal of conduct and tells us to live up to that ideal regardless of what other persons are doing. The results may be very bad, she says. End of quote. The idea here is that Kant insists on an ideal of moral conduct without taking into account what other persons are doing, and that this makes us powerless in the face of evil in a potentially disastrous way. Korsgaard cites Kant's rigorism regarding the duty to tell the truth in all circumstances as an instance of this. However, the claim that Kant's ethical theory disregards what others are doing and leaves us powerless in dealing with evil requires further defense. First, contra Korsgaard, there are at least some passages in which Kant does not seem to be unmindful of what other people are doing in a way that would render us powerless to deal with evil. Kant says, for instance, that meek tolerance of an offense against one's person is to, quote, throw away one's rights and violate the duty to oneself, end of quote. This is from the Metaphysics of Morals. In another passage, despite his condemnation of violence, he often condemns violence. Kant says that coercion can be used in self-defense. He actually says, well, you can have violent coercion if you're defending yourself, and that a state has a right to go to war with another state in the absence of a legal process. In these passages, like both from the Metaphysics of Morals, one can argue that Kant is neither aware of what others are doing, nor leaves us defenseless against evil for the following reason. Kant says, quote, the will is absolutely good, which cannot be evil. That is, whose maxim, when made into a universal law, can never conflict itself. End of quote, again from the groundwork. In other words, what this passage says is that evil maxims violate the CI, and since any unjust act on one's person or collective of the sort I just mentioned violates the CI, such attack must be considered evil. So if my person is attacked or my collective is attacked, well, that's an evil attack. It's violating the categorical imperative. Now, as indicated, Kant prescribes self-defense, even violent self-defense against such evil attack, and self-defense can hardly be seen as something that makes us powerless against evil or evil attack. Therefore, Kant seems neither unaware of what others are doing, nor does he leave us defenseless against evil, as Korsgaard says. Second, there is, of course, a sense in which Kant does not account for what others are doing. Right? Consider the famous gallows case, in which the prince demands on pain of execution that someone provide false testimony against an honorable man. This is famously from the Second Critique. Kant says that Kant says of this case that the person from whom the lie is demanded might not, quote, venture to assert whether he would do it or not, but he must admit without hesitation that it would be possible for him. End of quote. So he can't say for sure that he's going to lie in this. He's not going to lie in this particular situation, but it's at least possible for him not to lie and basically go against the prince. This suggests that Kant is well aware of the pressure that evil can put on persons. But it is hardly the case that someone not succumbing to evil is in any sense powerless in this instance. In fact, your refusal to lie in this particular case, even if your life is at stake, would make you sublime, right? And that's, again, very clear in the groundwork, right? And it is at least not obvious that Kant would equate sublimity and powerlessness in the face of evil. Therefore, Korsgaard claims that Kant's moral philosophy does not allow us to deal with evil, requires further justification. Here, of course, it might be objected that the gallows case is very different from the murderer case. The lie is meant to hurt someone in the gallows case, but help someone in the murderer case. However, Korsgaard's contention that Kant does not give us a way of dealing with evil can hardly be justified by merely pointing out the difference between the two cases. What is needed instead is an account of why Kant thinks that lying is always wrong, irrespective of whether one lies to help or hurt another. So in conclusion, in The Right to Lie, Korsgaard aims to refute Kant's position that one must not lie in the murderer case. I have argued that at least as it stands, Korsgaard has not succeeded in her goal, and so evaluating the merits of Kant's response to the murderer case is work that remains to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Apaar. I think my throat is really awful. I hope I'm audible. We have 8 minutes, so we can have some questions. Yes, please.
Hi, Apaar. Thanks a lot for the rigorous paper. I was just wondering, your argument against Korsgaard, you mentioned that causality and temporality cannot be a part and parcel of the CCI. So I was wondering, and you also made a mention of the mental disposition. So I was wondering, because Korsgaard may be referring to the notion of motivation when she's speaking about the efficacy test. And also because you were not mentioning anything about doctrine of virtue. I was wondering what is your take on that, because Kant constantly talks about virtue as moral fortitude, and more importantly, he talks about the psychological preconditions. And so I'm wondering if that can be taken as a form of causality. Like for a moral action to occur, one has to have, a certain mental disposition built, and that would lead to the end. So if we can bring that into the mix, I would like to know how your argument would hold against Korsgaard.
But when he talks about mental disposition, he's not talking about moral feeling of respect at all. That's not an issue or at least arguably, or at least there's no interpretation that says that when he's talking about mental disposition in the groundwork, he's talking about the moral feeling of respect. Nothing like that. So, I mean, maybe causality comes into the picture once you are sort of, moral feeling, respect, and motivational issues and so on come into the picture. But in an explanatory sense, when you think of CCI, it's purely rational, right? And it's the contradiction within the CCI is purely a rational contradiction. It does not require any causality, right? It's as you know, with the CCI, when you talk about the CCI, you talk about all rational beings and not about human beings at all. And feeling and moral feeling of respect is something that goes with ultimately humans trying to get to apply the moral law in every possible situation. So that's just not an issue. Virtue, of course, is also higher level, right? He talks about it once or twice, but mostly it comes in the metaphysics of morals, where he's basically concerned with some of the application related issues. So this is not an issue for my paper at all, right? I'm not talking about that.
Yes, Babu.
I don't know. I mean, I'm unable to articulate my question the way you give the paper because I'm not used to it. But my simple, I'm trying to make it very simple. I mean, one can't use the term lie.
Mhm.
I mean, it's a term. It's in German, Lüge.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's a word used. I mean, it should be defined contextually and adequately, right? And it varies. Yeah. So in this particular, so he's universalizing this lie and giving a particular example, which obviously contradicts the moral principles. In this case, I would say that lie or the truth. It would, if he say yes, he's here. It's a moral lie, in a kind of a destructive truth. And I'm just trying to, and later that's the reason why the more skeptical Nietzsche says on truth and lies in an extra moral sense. There's no lie. There are three forms of truth: angenehme Wahrheit, the comfortable truth, and the destructive truth, and the neutral truth.
Mm-hmm.
So these type of dealing it within the language, yeah, and again that helps us to contextualize in a lie in a theoretical or pragmatical or and the purposiveness of all this. Just going forward.
Okay, let me try and paraphrase what you're asking. I'm still not completely sure, but let me try and paraphrase what you're asking. You're saying, well, if you look at lying in a kind of linguistic sense, right? The connotations of lying, let's say, right? If that's the kind of thing that you would do, then you would do some kind of linguistic or philosophy of language analysis on it, and say, well, then it's not an issue. I mean, in this particular issue, there's a particular connotation of lying where when you do lie to the murderer, it's actually not immoral at all. It's moral in some senses, right? That's roughly the kind of thing. That's how I understood it. So correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I mean it's I mean everything is in language. That's the point. Even the Ten Commandments is in language. I mean the whole the thou shalt not lie and thou shalt not commit murder or adultery and all. But there's a hierarchy. There's again a division within the context of Christianity, the mortal sins and all.
Yeah,
okay, I'm not talking about that background. So I'm talking about like when you use the language and like we judge through the language, and there's always a problem of the meaning, the definition, what that you give, and in circumstance, within context and all. So I'm just wondering, why Kant giving this particular example, which is somehow doesn't support his categorical imperative.
I mean, Kant wouldn't. The whole point is, look, I'm giving you a criterion to distinguish moral from immoral maxims, right? And on this criterion, if you apply this particular criterion, well, lying comes on the immoral side, right? And he's giving you an argument for that. Now, Constant comes and problematizes that. Now, language cannot be an issue here just for the following reason. I think fairly simple reason. You do have to act, right? I mean, I'm not gonna. I mean, the murderer comes to the door and asks me. I have to either say yes or no if I'm being compelled, right? And then I have to decide whether to say yes or no. I can't. I mean, language is in that sense. I mean, he's assuming, and Constant is also assuming that we all know in a sense what it is not to say what is the case, right? And so, I mean, the question then is, are you going to lie or are you not going to lie? So, I mean, I don't know if that helps, but that's my response.
So we have 4 questions. I think first Krishna, and then Nishad, and then Peter. I think I can take only 4. We don't have time. I'm really sorry. It's first Krishna.
Thank you
Please
very
keep
much
it short.
for
Sure.
this talk. And I was just going to kind of push back against what you were saying, just to get your thoughts on it.
Yeah.
About how CHI and CCI are different based on temporality and causality.
Right.
Now, is there an interpretation that we can give? And I'm going to give one, and then say that therefore they're not, CCI and CHI are not 2 different kinds. So one is to think about CCI and the difference between CCI and CHI in terms of universality versus non-universality in terms of, say, scope, let's say. So that would make it that in both cases, so the CCI is universal, whereas CHI is obviously what I want to do. I want to have dinner and I can't.
Right.
So if you kind of make that the interpretive framework, then it would seem that you can bring in causality and temporality in both, because the only difference there, it seems to be that in CCI, it's just universal, whereas in CHI, it is individual, let's say. But the rest of it just works in. There's causality, you can have temporality and everything. So, yeah.
But how do you do that? How do you do that in terms of CCI? You'll have to give us an account of that.
So for example, so let's say lying, So lying is something that I will, that everybody wills, right? And so if that is the case, then in terms of what I intend to do is based on the maxim or the moral maxim that I don't want to lie, right? But it's just like I don't want to, if I want to have food, I have to go to the fridge. Yeah. So similarly, if I want to be moral, I still have to intend, right? So I have to do all the things that are causally required of me. I still have to make sure that daily I don't lie, and if somebody is lying, I say that's wrong, and so on and so forth. So in both cases, it is
So the idea of disposition here is, if you do develop that disposition, right? And remember, the test of the CI is going to be if, in ideal terms, that disposition has been developed, right? If you have that disposition, it's instant. I mean, after all, you go from all humans are mortal, so Socrates is human to Socrates is mortal. That is instant. I mean, there may be some philosophy of mind that you might be able to, give for it, but it's an instant logical move. It's not something that you're working on, right? Especially if it's a small, it's a simple syllogism like the one that I mentioned, right? Similarly, with the categorical imperative, if you do, and of course you may not, if you don't, then maybe it's really an effort for you. That goes back to Vivek's question, right? It's a huge effort for you to sort of, prepare yourself not to lie. But I mean, if you do have the categorical imperative packed, then it's instant, right? There is no question for you. Remember what Kant said, it will not even be a question for you whether you lie or not. It's just going to be not lie. It's always going to be the truth. So the distinction that you're making between, first of all, the universalization, non-universalization just doesn't work here, right? Because, the very fact that CHI is different from CCI sort of relates to this non-universalizability of the HI as opposed to the CCI, right? Because, I may need dinner and may need to walk to the fridge, but you're not hungry. Right. So roughly that's the way, and you might have to give up. You may have an argument, but you'll have to sort of develop that.
Yeah, Nishad, and then Arina.
Yeah, thanks a lot. To me, I mean, it's just obvious that the categorical imperative cannot be reduced to the hypothetical. I mean, that's just so. The point is,
Again,
towards the end,
go on, sorry.
towards the end, you kind of suggest, aren't we back to square one with Kant's liar paradox then? And so, do we just so from your few remarks at the end? Does it mean that we tell the truth in such cases, don't lie, where the murderer is at the doorstep, and then defend ourselves? Is that?
Again? What's the?
So you said that Kant allows self-defense, allows your own dignity not to be trampled, etc.
Right.
So is the practical solution then that since you cannot lie, to kind of tell the truth that yes, this person is there, and then defend oneself? I mean, that seems to be the only.
Well, so two things. First of all, I wouldn't use the word reduce. She's not using the word reduce. She's saying of the same sort. Two different things, right? So this paper was not about whether you can reduce the CCI to CHI or not. She's not doing that. She's saying it's of the same sort. Again, that's vague. So that I agree with that. But it's clear enough to say that she's extrapolating from the, she thinks she can extrapolate from the CHI to the CCI, right? That's the big claim that she's making. The second point, this is I mean, I've looked at almost all the literature in German and in English on this issue. And I'm saying that there is, at this point, not a single charitable interpretation of Kant on this particular issue. Not a single one, and I'm saying this. So that's the larger project that I have. This is a small part of that project. I mean, this paper is also a small part of the Korsgaard paper, and then this is, that is a smaller part of the larger project. But coming back to the more interesting, substantive part of the question, I have another paper which I've recently presented somewhere where I am arguing that Korsgaard does not take into account, not just Korsgaard, no one else does, also does not take into account what Kant himself says about this. And Kant says, look, why is it not a better solution to do exactly what you suggested? Tell the truth and then call the neighbors, create a huge ruckus, find a way of saving, I mean, it'll be 2 against 1. There'll be the murderer and it'll be you and your friend, so that's something. That's what he says. That's what he says. Now, why does he say that? Why does he say that? He says that, look, you can never in this kind of situation figure out a priori, in any sense, all the consequences of what's going to happen. Because that's the other example. And Korsgaard discusses it and says, Kant is crazy. It's fantastic. It's grotesque, right? But what Kant says is that, look, you cannot at that particular, you're finite, you cannot at that particular point of time figure out all the consequences that are going to be in play, right? So if you do lie, and your friend, without your knowledge, has sneaked out of the room, and the murderer finds him and kills him, well, then you are responsible. Now, he makes a very strong claim. He says you are legally, ethically, and legally responsible. Now, you don't have to go that far. You don't have to say legally responsible, perhaps. But ethically, I mean, think of it. If you lied and your friend did get murdered because of your lie, you'd be as much traumatized as if you told the truth and your friend sort of. So if you don't think that that's the case, then you'll have to make then you have to make a case for that.
Okay.
You'll have to make a case for why you would be more traumatized. So that's something that you'll have to argue for. It's not something that's obvious. It may be obvious to you, but it's not rationally obvious, is the claim. Right? Now, again, I'm not defending Kant here. Maybe I'll defend Kant at some point, but at this point, I'm not defending Kant. I'm just saying that easy criticisms here, like the one that you're saying, no, I won't be that traumatized, is not useful. You need an argument for that, right? If you're going to work with reason, if you're just going to work with some kind of moral sense theory or some kind of human account or something like that, well, go ahead. Then you have nothing to do with Kant. Right? I mean, after all, Mill says that you would lie. But what in utilitarianism, he says, yeah, you would lie. But why would you lie? He doesn't give us an account of that. Even not even a utilitarian account for why you would lie in this particular situation. Give us that account at least, right? So anyway, that's roughly
It was a great paper. So I have 3 very brief comments. One is that it's amazing what you have shown. I haven't read that particular paper by, it's not in the sources of normativity, it's some other paper.
Yeah, it's a different paper.
So, but I think I can put it very bluntly. Korsgaard makes Kant into a closet consequentialist just by making the CCI and CHI of the same kind. You are absolutely right about that. Although one should be a little considerate. How could Korsgaard, who in sources of normativity is a Kantian, in some sense, she's definitely no friend of the utilitarian.
No, of course not. In many articles she said that.
Right.
Yeah.
So how could she suddenly sort of turn into this thing? I think the reason is, even when we studied and I taught for years and years, the 4 cases, okay, the formula are also different. Act such that your maxim can become a universal law through
Yes.
your will.
Yes.
First one,
Yes.
promise keeping,
Yes.
promise breaking, etc. But then law of nature. Why the second formulation, law of nature?
Fantastic. Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Now that, and not developing talent, okay, not helping the child, especially not helping a drowning person, etc. That sounds, and this is my second comment, that you are doing Kant hermeneutics, but you're also substantially discussing the right to lie to a murderer issue. About that, it would be a shame if you do not discuss the source of this question, even culturally, which is the Mahabharata. And Matilal has done a huge amount of work on this, published work, Moral Dilemmas in Mahabharata elsewhere, showing that this whole business of saving a person by telling a lie to a murderer, not saving and therefore committing a, being the cause of the death, etc., of Kaushika's story, that comes from the Mahabharata. Not just that, 19th century, late 19th century, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, an inveterate utilitarian, takes the side of he should have lied to save. And you said whoever supported Kant, Rabindranath Tagore supports Kant by saying no, universally, and gives, without mentioning Tagore or without mentioning Kant, I am 100% certain he read that, because he said the same argument. Even by lying, he might, have counter-suggested to the murderer and therefore cause, etc. Now, it will be a shame for any version of the longer version of your paper. I think this thing about right to lie deserves a monograph, and that would be.
That's how I'm thinking of it.
Yeah. Finally, when you are talking deontic logic, there is a very simple device of converting hypothetical imperatives to categorical imperatives. Instead of saying, if somebody is seeking happiness, they should eat healthy food. You could say, all happiness-seeking people should eat healthy food. So you build in the antecedent clause into a predicate of that first, of the for all x fx implies gx. In the f, you build that in. And you have to take care of that because Kant is aware of that, which is why a very important distinction you didn't make, it's not relevant, between 2 kinds of hypothetical imperatives. One, where the antecedent is optional, which he calls rules of skill. That if you want to become a technology person, then you study engineering. That's rules of skill. But the dictates of prudence, it is not an option. The antecedent is universal. Everybody wants happiness. It's still conditional but you can see that the trilemma, that threefold structure is emerging there. So it's like pure hypothetical, pure categorical. In between comes this. And if you consider that, maybe you can be kinder to Korsgaard, that there was a point at which she was saying that the practical contradictions, in the case of not rules of skill.
Mhm.
They are of a different kind.
Mhm.
Even without bringing causality,
Mhm.
they would be of the same kind for all happiness-seeking people.
Mhm.
Should be, if you say, yeah, I'm happiness-seeking, but I won't do that.
Mhm.
It is an intention-related, and that was his point,
Mhm.
that if you bring in the relation of motivation, the first question, the relation between motivation and action,
Mhm.
it's not a normal causation. It's like intentional mental causation,
Mhm.
which becomes relevant for actually cashing out the contradiction that will happen if you violate a certain a categorical. So I think
Since
these
it's
are
a
the-
comment, shall I take the last one, the last
Oh,
question?
okay,
We are
okay,
running
yeah,
out.
all
Really
right.
sorry about that. Yes, please.
Okay. Deontological theories like Kant's are always criticized because they ignore the consequences of
Right,
action.
right.
But this particular criticism, which Kant doubles down on,
Mhm.
involves language. It's lying. And language is, I think, important here in two different ways.
Mhm.
One, normally you use language to convey content.
Right.
In this case, you're using language to cause behavior.
Right.
That is, you're violating the other form of the categorical imperative, treating the person at the door not as an end in themselves, but as something to be causally manipulated.
Mhm.
And that involves another thing of language, which Hegel actually talks about in a popular thing on abstract and concrete. What's a murderer? The person at the door is a human being with a mother, debts on his credit card, and all kinds of other things. He is being treated as an abstraction murderer. So Kant is pointing out, I think, that you are not treating a person as an end in themselves. So that he's admitting this is a consequence of my kind of ethics. And I think the other categorical formulation of the categorical imperative, that you are not treating the person at the door as a person.
Yeah, so just quick response. In her paper, she talks about this formula of humanity, the one that you're mentioning. And in fact, she ends up, in her own non-ideal theory, she ends up talking about how actually FH, or formula of humanity, is actually the most stricter one. And it's what you will need to make the ideal world to create the kingdom of ends, right? But the formula of humanity can be violated in exceptional situations like these, right? As opposed to the formula of universal law, which basically you cannot violate it if it's not any kind of evil situation, right? So you must always lie, except that you can, in some evil situations, still the kingdom of end has come, you can continue to lie. So in this situation, you can lie. This is ultimately where Korsgaard is going, right? So the problem is that she is, and this is go back to his first comment, she is interpreting FU. So she says, okay, FUL subordinate, so want to create an ideal world, FH. FUL, you can't violate, right? If it's not an evil situation. Ultimately, that's where she ends. The problem is that FUL is something that she's interpreting. She's conflating FUL and FLN. So the idea that, you can sort of use motivation is actually not going to be a very good way of doing it, because if you go from FUL, which is the most abstract, and then you go to FLN, which is not that abstract, and then you go to FH, and then you go to FA, and then you go to FKE, right? In each case, so by the time and for him, motivation is not an issue, because all of these formulae are equivalent. They are equivalent. They are just, he says, I'm with each formula, they're equivalent, but I am bringing it closer to intuition. And again, intuition is a vague word there, right? Basically, he's saying this is a pedagogical exercise, right? I mean, I'm bringing it closer to your intuition, what it would mean. And then once you have this, then he's not worked out. I mean, the passages that I'm saying, he's not even worked out this notion of an all feeling of respect, right? Which is, of course, coming from Feder and others. It's not a new concept within the tradition.
Imagination.
Huh?
Intuition here in Kant just means imagination. A sense-original.
Yeah, I mean, that would be, I mean, you mean something like a productive imagination or something like that?
Perceptual generality.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks,
Thank
Apaar.
you.
Now, Meghant, please.
No, it's just that one. So, just a couple of remarks. Firstly, thanking Bhaskar, but I want to clarify I'm not a Kantian ethicist. But I'm glad there are Kantian ethicists here, and at least some for a fact that I know, and there are surely others, and you should feel free to tell me where how Kantian ethicists would see what I'm saying. Sorry, I'm just written these scratch notes and I can't read them. In fact, I'm not even sure I'm a Kantian at this point, owing to just the fact that I've been just so busy in the modern condition of the world where there is no work but there's a lot of busyness. And there I wanted to actually thank Dr. Sarkar and Dr. Natraju because I was seeing this as a way for me to get back to Kant, as we are all trying to get back to Kant at this point. And this came up yesterday as the attitude, and I second Dr. Tomi's view that one has to surrender to Kant or to any philosopher, surrender to the thought in order to think along with the philosopher. So that's my thanks to the organizers for letting me get back to Kant and to surrender to Kant. A quick sketch of how I'll be going is in the first few minutes I'll lay out a number of questions that fall for me under the idea of self-respect. And my point again is not to answer each and every one of them. That would also take forever. But kind of in the spirit that Dr. McLaughlin was saying yesterday, of using a small pot to try and see the bigger picture in a way, which I'm putting madly, but something like that is what I intend to do with that. So I'll start with those questions, and which were occasioned in the course of teaching Kant, and then try to build towards this, what I take this larger picture to mean. Okay, so I'll start reading. Respect is a basic element of the moral world that appears in several manifestations. Thus, one can think of it as a disposition or as an attitude that colors all our actions, or one can see it as expressed in specific actions that are legible as respectful, or one can take it as an attribute of a person or their character, or one can hold it to be a consideration that should be extended to each and every one. And we encounter it in different degrees in various sorts of personal conduct and interpersonal relations. Respect is also a key concept for Kantian ethics, where it names the process whereby morality itself becomes present for us in some fundamental sense. It replaces the usual course of things, the humdrum hustle and bustle of transactions and calculations and motives, with a clear moral vision of what just must be done. It cuts through the web of desires in which we are constantly entangled and projects the actualization of pure practical reason through us and generates moral content in us and for us. Respect is morality itself subjectively considered, as Kant puts it at one place.
In this paper, I'll try to sketch some features of the Kantian account to respond to the question in the title: does Kantian ethics have room for self-respect in its account of respect? This question is one that students often ask upon reading Kant's brief remarks about respect in the opening section of the groundwork. And in fact, the title is guilty of restating it here verbatim from one such conversation. Like many others, and especially as someone ridden, as I was mentioning, with the Kantian ethicist imposter syndrome, I have hand waved towards some things in response and called for further thought into the matter. Those caveats also apply here, and this may be just a more vigorous case of hand waving, imposturing, but the question remains current and recurrent, and it contains several other questions within it that demand to be addressed. And in the following, I'll flesh out one way for doing so. A commonly shared in so this is where I lay out some of these questions. The simple question: does respect have this priority, or does respect come first before all other respect giving? Can be fleshed out in a number of different ways. A commonly shared intuition is that self-respect is a necessary condition for respect. And then one asks how to develop that notion in a Kantian frame. For it seems that only by having respect firmly grounded in oneself can we go on to accord respect beyond oneself. Whether one thinks of this self-grounding of respect as stemming from a fundamental value one either prepossesses or ascribes to oneself as a moral agent in the first place, or if one thinks of self-respect as a kind of situational awareness that allows one to either function respectfully in a given environment or to have a place, standpoint, or moral standing at all. There are further questions attached to those, like whether having self-respect first means that respect must first be earned in order to pay respect forward, or whether it is the other way around and one must pay respects in order to earn it, or whether the two are independent of each other and whether they together form a reciprocal interaction that then needs us to look into the social institutional settings wherein these give and take processes take place. Or one wonders about the way that having self-respect first is something that can be cashed out at an intuitive rather than a conceptual level, especially since Kant talks about respect as a kind of feeling, as an obscure feeling, a singular feeling. This perhaps one could talk of having or giving respect at more advanced levels as deriving from an earlier foundation in a preconceptual grasp of one's subjectivity, such that the talk of respecting others as ends in themselves and not using them as means, according to formulas of the categorical imperative, could somehow derive from foundations given in primitive feeling. Related to the issue of respect being a feeling, two further issues arise. First, an invocation of feeling, while it helps provide a psychologically richer, deformalized account of moral subjectivity than one usually associates with Kantian ethics, remains risky to that same extent, to the extent that the mechanics of feeling remain generally unclear, even while setting aside thornier issues of transcendental affection. Specifically, Kant talks of respect as a self-wrought feeling that thereby distinguishes it from all feelings that are received through external influence. And yet, it is like all feelings that may be ultimately sorted into perceptions of pleasure and pain, and respect may even be a complex of feelings rather than one identified by its unique simplicity. Second, the Kantian characterizations of respect carry a jarring note. For the required subordination of inclinations and the self-subjection to the moral law that is offered either as a condition of respect or as identical with it, leads not only to a general lowering of self-appraisal, but as Kant emphasizes, it brings about a certain kind of humiliation. The experience of the moral law as a sheer command creates a rift that seems to adversely impact self-respect by downgrading our own sense of self, even as it elevates the subject or object of respect. One can soften the harsher notes first by recalling that the real idea involved in all this concerns the production of a gentler type of humility rather than a scathing form of insult. And second, by repositioning the rift as between the sensible human being and an abstract rational subjectivity, or between a propensity to natural pride and a capacity for cultivated reverence, or between an individual with whose character I have greater acquaintance and another who is a stranger or at least relatively unfamiliar. Such proposals, however, still come up against a strong demand from the moral law for a complete exclusion of the desiring self, which maintains the moderated rift in still irreconcilable forms. A third set of questions concerning the priority of self respect pertains not to claims about the acquisition, distribution, and disbursement of respect, or to its nature as a feeling, but to claims about the object of respect. For Kant compares respect to the closely allied sentiment of admiration and says that respect is only given to persons, never things, while admiration can also extend to things. This distinction seems consistent with the primacy of self respect, but prima facie arbitrary, and then at odds with Kant's reminders that respect is not even for a person, but for the moral law itself, while this or that person exemplifies it in some way, and that treating persons as ends, not means, depends ultimately on respecting an idea rather than directly through personhood, which again requires sorting out which person is actually respected and which humiliated through the moral law. Kant's keen observations elaborating the moral psychology of admiration and respect in the Critique of Practical Reason generate further questions about overlaps between the two in the case of something like respecting the environment, and questions about distinguishing the mere prick of conscience as the core or principle of respectful regard as what is ideally intended, distinguishing that from the thicker comparative evaluations shared by both respect and admiration. Thus, in sum, much of what Kant says about respect in these passages sound intuitively plausible, but in need of clarification. Let's consider a little more closely some key critical texts that help make some headway with those topics before I close with a couple of speculative strategies of interpretation. I've just thrown up one text from the groundwork, which is on respect, the famous footnote. There are many others. I'll start with that. So it's not the most important just because it's staying up. I just don't think we have time to sort of go through each and every one of them. But it gives us an opportunity to think more closely about that one. Kant initially offers the concept of respect in the well-known footnote in section 1 of the groundwork. Seeing this definition, one may provisionally presume that self-respect and other respect are modes of respect as such, which is a kind of bare consciousness that seizes upon the respecter with the force of feeling and motivates her to seek its object or ground, which in turn opens up possibilities of determining selfhood with its own variations. The footnote only characterizes this bare consciousness as a feeling and provides some initial remarks about the quality of this feeling, but they remain quickly jotted notes at this point. I submit again provisionally for now that we can think of this 0 point of feeling as the origin of the idea of conscience that proceeds, both generically and logically, from an initial prick to a deeper internal tribunal of self-assessment. But this is not yet addressed in the footnote. What is discussed here comprises, to begin with, the definition of respect as the consciousness of the immediate subordination of the will by a law, and then next follow corollary reflections about respect, which show first that respect is an effect of the law on the subject and not the cause of the law. Second, that respect represents curbing self-love, from which, third, it follows that it is like a feeling, although different in kind from regular feelings, which are received externally and classified as either pleasurable or painful. Fourth, that the object of respect is a law that we submit to willingly, which helps explain the analogies with pleasure and pain. And fifth, that the object of respect is properly a law, and that respect attributed to persons follows from persons illustrating a given law through their example. Here in this footnote, we get some core features of respect that are developed in different dimensions in later texts, most prominently in the critical period, in the chapter on incentives, in the critique of practical reason. There, Kant builds further in two important directions. First, by laying out the composition and progress of feeling at greater length, and second, by providing a comparison of respect with a similar feeling of admiration. As far as the first point goes, Kant details on why respect is held to be a feeling. Primarily, he says, this is because the way that respect, as the consciousness of duty, functions is that it restrains all inclinations, which was already the context provided for it in the initial sketch of the groundwork. Kant tells us in the second critique, this is a quote, that, quote, all inclination and every sensible impulse is based on feeling, and the negative effect on feeling by the infringement upon the inclinations that take place is itself feeling. So all inclinations are based on feeling, the negative effect on feeling is itself feeling. End quote. Moreover, now Kant elaborates that this infringement restrains not just self-love absolutely, but by distinguishing two moments within a general self-regard as the sum of all inclinations tending to our happiness. There is, on the one hand, self-love that naturally belongs to us as human animals and is built on a basic drive to self-preservation and fulfillment of needs, which make us look out for ourselves by raising our own neediness and happiness into focus. On the other hand, there's a moment of self-conceit, of an arrogance and egotism that exaggerates our sense of self-importance by pushing the naturally active drive of self-love into the form of a subjective practical principle that conditions all our actions. Now, quote, striving to make its claims primary and originally valid, just as if it constituted our entire self, end quote. Notice too that these moments are relative aspects insofar as self-love functions as Notice too that these moments are relative aspects insofar as self-love functions as a self-preservation, relative to accompanying agential beings who too are objects of concern as well as subjects of self-concern. And conceit and arrogance has for its context the contemptible others in an obvious fashion. Against this relativizing context, the law of morality for Kant directs us to the absolute standpoint of reason as a non-relative unconditioned. Under the corrective light of morality, the former, the natural drive to look out for oneself, can indeed be guided through the moral law into a form consistent with the rational use of freedom, for example, in injunctions against suicide. The latter, however, self-conceit, is struck down with pure vehemence. Quote, pure practical reason strikes down self-conceit altogether, since all claims to esteem for oneself that precede accord with the moral law are null and quite unwarranted, because certainty of a disposition in accord with the law is the first condition of any worth of a person. End quote. Kant stresses repeatedly that this smashing down of egotistic conceit is a type of humiliation, and thus the feeling of respect contains a strongly negative note of humiliation. In this vein, he also deepens the talk of subordination of the will by talking of being brought down by the moral law. And yet, respect contains a positive side too, for, as Kant tells us, the negating moment of respect, as curbing self-regard, functions as a negation of an obstacle to the action of morality. As removing a hindrance Respect furthers the causality of pure practical reason, and this is reason to attribute a positive moment to the feeling of respect as well. And the whole feeling then is a mix of negative and positive attributes, a unique mix of pain and pleasure, a humiliating putting down along with an uplifting elevation. After all, even the ordinary usage of the German word for respect, Achtung, contains the sense of the English colloquialism heads up. But is all this really felt in respect, one wants to know? Is it in fact a mix of pleasure and pain? Here we have to be careful, for Kant is not manufacturing complex emotions from out of a basket of building blocks of simple ones. That respect must be a feeling is gleaned from the negation of inclination ordered by the moral law. There are other questions about this inference, about whether and how a feeling of trouncing feelings is itself a feeling, and how feelings trounce feelings on this view, about the potential derivation of the positive dimensions of this feeling from a reformed self love, about the strange proximity of the causality of freedom to older models of causation that take freedom to consist merely in the removal of impediments, etc. Those remain to be investigated at another time, but for the moment we should at least see that Kant is more interested in describing the composition and dynamics of this inferred feeling in order to make it fit our common experiences, rather than asserting its actuality as a fact. The comparison of respect with admiration aims at measuring this fit better, but his overriding interest is in the question about how morality, whose concept as an objective necessity is taught in the moral law, functions as a subjective incentive, and as he puts it, quote, what it affects, or to put it better, what it must affect in the mind, end quote. He explains that there is no pre existing moral feeling in a subject that would lead us to moral actions, such as a positive feeling or inclination for ice cream leads me to the action of eating it. And in any case, the whole idea of morality rests on nonsensical grounds for him. And yet, an appeal to feeling must be made because it is precisely the fact of having a sensibly weighted reason that constitutes the subject of Kantian morality. In investigating this subject, Kant is interested not only in the way that morality becomes present to and for an actual individual, the unconditional objectivity of pure reason made manifest in the realm of conditioned subjectivity, but and precisely because morality, as the causality of freedom, contains an inscrutable form of necessity, and moral obligation contains a peculiar mode of form of necessitation. Because of this, precisely because of this, one must inquire into the peculiar claims of the a priori here. This is why Kant says about respect as a feeling, the subjective reception of, or the subjection to the moral law, that, quote, here we have the first and perhaps the only case in which we can determine a priori from concepts the relation of a cognition to the feeling of pleasure or displeasure, end quote. Kant will come to revise his proposition in the third critique, and we'll touch on this soon. But first, I want to briefly mention relevant features of Kant's comparison of admiration and respect, and then Kant's use of comparative frameworks to understand self regard. Another quote: respect is always directed only to persons, never to things, says Kant. And he compares respect with the closely related feeling of admiration to bring this out. For things that are admired can be objects of inclination so far as they bring pleasure, and even human beings can be admired for qualities that are appraised highly. But respect just has been defined through an exclusion of inclination, and respect is granted in the presence of a moral exemplar, even in the absence of any qualities of distinction and rank. To Fontenelle's saying that I bow before an eminent man, but my spirit does not bow, Kant rejoins, before a humble common man, in whom I perceive uprightness of character in a higher degree than I am aware of in myself, my spirit bows, whether I want it or do not, and hold my head ever so high. End quote. This is because his observance of the moral law strikes down my self conceit. And even if there's an indifference to degrees of comparison, Kant adds, my respect remains, because I am always aware of my own foibles, but not his. Respect is not a pleasure because I reluctantly give it or indulge in that feeling. And I insist on the other earning it, and I'm ever on the lookout for some scandal about the other to relieve me of the burden of this feeling, or even into pleasant aspects drawing from the elevating features of respect. Even into those, I insert comparisons to cause myself reproach for not having done as well as the other, not having done as well as I could have. This passage, still from the same chapter on incentives and the critical practical reason, talks of respect as being neither pleasure nor displeasure, and thus not a real mix of sentiments, but rather a way through sentimentality to exit it altogether. But it also highlights another feature that I had flagged earlier about the usual order of things for the self loving human being who navigates an empirical social comparative framework, where she stands as well as tries to stand out among others. But it is only when she compares herself not with others, but with the austere majesty of the moral law, does she arrive at the moral standpoint. The way to this, to return to the harsh Kantian word, passes through humiliation, whereas the social order only allows for adjustments through humility. And yet it remains Kant's claim that that's where authentic forms of selfhood and personhood lie. The Collins lectures bring out this contrast of humility and humiliation in the context of the social order in more vivid detail. And they're important to recall here ever so briefly, simply to highlight that Kant attaches to that the story of conscience that has been missing so far. Both like and unlike, just one second. Both like and unlike Hobbesian conscientia that internalizes a thousand witnesses into oneself, Kant's discussion of conscience describes the way that the initial prick of conscience lies in us as merely an instinct to direct, this is a quote from the Collins lectures, an instinct to direct oneself according to the moral law. It lies as just an instinct, but develops into the full-fledged erection of an internal tribunal that accuses through a public prosecutor representing the moral law, while the prudential social agent brings with himself his defense counsel in the form of self-love, and an impartial judge is called upon to pronounce and execute sentencing. The processes of conscience have the same structure as respect, but lead on to eventually describe its work, on the one hand, as a coupling of respect with fear, and on the other hand, emphasize the social prudential settings for the work of respect to be carried out. The concept of conscience and its structural homologies with respect help see how we are led through basic forms of self-respect as self-validation in the social sphere, and through to a doubled or triple selfhood in the court of reason, to a fundamental respect, self-respect grounded in moral practice. Respect as such, then, names the dialectic that aims at the perfection of self-respect. The story of conscience returns us to the expansion, as it were, of the pinprick of a moral feeling, through not only the moral psychology of respect, but also to Kant's systematic aims through this, which may be called a transcendental psychology or a philosophy of mind, depending on your preferences. For his remark about the a priori structures of this moral feeling was short-lived, as Kant went on in the third critique to find other forms of relating the faculty of feeling with the question of a priori knowledge. There, we find numerous instances of Kant identifying and investigating homologies of respect with aesthetic judgments of reflection. But more crucially, he also tries to locate the source of the aspect of pleasure in the feeling of respect in the harmony of faculties as a type of internal causality, made evident through principles of reflective judgment, even though differences between the experiences of respect and those of beauty and sublimity remain. Similarly, he finds homologies in the way that the mathematical sublime does violence to our powers of sensible representation in order to conceive of the absolutely great, and the feeling of respect that too exits the sphere of mundane transactions through humiliation to seek an absolute value beyond all price. Similarly, the inner form of the experience of the sublime was that of a caesura that breaks a normal state of satisfaction, followed by the returning rush of a vital feeling, which also maps on to the inner constitution of respect as a displeasure immediately followed by pleasure, paradoxically in the same instant. The subordinating humiliation by moral elevation. And now defining respect as, quote from the third critique, the feeling, respect is defined here as the feeling of inadequacy of our capacity for the attainment of an idea that is a law for us. End quote. And now defining respect as this, Kant even allows here for transferences of the moral feeling of respect and the feeling of the sublime in nature, which speaks to the overlaps of respect for persons and things in the case of environment that many perceive to be possible. While one can reach a respect for the environment in the usual Kantian way of taking our treatment of things as occasions for developing a moral interest in personhood, here we are given a possibility in the movements of mind itself that Kant also extends to the feeling of humility under a moral disposition. Precisely the confluence of the mental foundations of the feeling of the sublime and the predispositions to moral feeling allow one, Kant says, to lift empirical psychology itself as a description of grades of pleasure and pain into the realm of transcendental philosophy, as an inquiry into the a priori principles of mind. I won't further multiply examples of these leads to broaden and rehabilitate the concept of respect into a transcendental theory of mind. I'll close with a final suggestive thought in Kant that points to the ultimate priority of self-respect for Kant, since that may have fallen a bit out of view through these excursions beyond Kant's practical philosophy. So far, we have seen respect as a subjective consciousness of morality that is in some sense correlative and has a directedness to act, driven by the priority of an ideal self as the true subject of respect. This inner directedness was not only given in the instinct-like disposition of conscience as a subjective experience of morality, coeval with the movements of respect, but also simply in the repeated assertions of the directionality built into the feeling of respect as at once a downgrading and an uplifting, its elemental heads up feature. This would no doubt remind us of Kant's little 1786 essay on orienting oneself in thinking, which is a reflection on the power of reason to orient itself, and of feeling as a property of reason itself. There, Kant talked of the analogy of how mere feeling lets us orient ourselves in space, and the power of reason to give itself orientation in thinking. Reason's existence as a cognitive drive recognizes its own intrinsic vacuum of all intuition, and Kant, along with all the rich ambiguity of his phrasing, describes this as a felt aspect of reason. Reason as a cognitive drive is a feeling. Orienting oneself starts with a given direction to find others through an inner feeling. Reason's life as an act expresses this need of a given direction as a moral feeling, as Kant says in footnote in this text. It starts. I'm keeping on an interpretation onto that footnote. It starts with the pure person as self and actualizes itself in the subjective form of an incentive. In the second critique, Kant had said that we cannot answer how the free will is itself possible. This would be asking how reason in its action is itself possible. And thus we don't know why morality takes the form of respect at all. While it is, of course, possible to analyze the actions of the finite subject as operating under the light of this idea. Just like the subject in space starts with feelings of right and left, above and below, we can add that that Kant's concept of respect starts with the high and the low as an elemental directional sense, as it enters the shared space of moral action. Self respect, then, is in the true sense of an ideal that orients reason's actions and thus has a priority before all else. To summarize in this paper, I, one, I have tried to think through the idea of respect by subsuming several current questions about respect as to its origin, distribution, nature, and object under the central question about self respect. Two, I've suggested that questions about self respect should be seen as a question about an interior space of reason in which one orients oneself. And three, I've indicated that the question about such a space of reason should follow Kant's lead in taking it out of the sphere of empirical psychology or even a transcendental psychology, if one means by this term the old reproach against rational psychology, and towards a critical systematic question of the synthetic a priori in general or transcendental philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Meghant. Now the paper is open. We have 10 minutes. Yes.
Thank you, Meghant, for the interesting paper. No, I mean, you touched on the idea of the object of respect. I think what problematizes Kant more is the idea of subject of respect. Whatever the subject is, if you are referring to the idea of self or the moral law or pure practical reason, it has to be the same subject that also causes humiliation. So this begs the question, how will I respect anything that humiliates me when I'm performing a moral action? So I think that's a very. So I would like to know, what your take, because both are so interconnected that so I have to feel respect because I've been humiliated by the law. But I mean, practically speaking, it's usually that's something that we don't do. I mean, how can I respect anything that humiliates me? So how would you respond to this question?
Well, the whole as a sequence of hand wavings was the hand waving response to that question, right? So I wanted to say that Kant keeps doubling down on just this feature, right? That there is humiliation, and he doesn't seem to have exactly the problem that faces all of us. And the way that one tries to do is just by separating this. I mean me in this way, an empirical self. I mean me in this way, etc. And but the problem, as you're saying, kind of still always remains because in some sense I have to reconcile these me's. Um, how I'm ending up here is by saying that Kant's notion of where I want to go is that the notion of self-respect that Kant has at a very fundamental level, as which is encoded in reason's need. Because why does reason have to be an incentive, right? There is no. It's just for the sake of our explanation or something that he offers that idea of respect at all. And I'm seeing it as his answer, especially in that last little text, is that somehow reason itself orients through this, and it gives this kind of a cunning of reason kind of view that it tries to orient itself through distinguishing between an empirical self and a pure self and getting the empirical self to, judge against other empirical selves towards the pure self, right? So it seems to me that Kant's answer, when he gives it, because otherwise he doesn't give it and the question keeps recurring. But when he does give it, at least as I'm trying to put it out, is in this form of trying to say that's just how reason acts at all. And there's probably more to it. And I don't know that's just a Hegelian flavor I've given him rather than an answer, but that's all I could find.
So it seems that Hegel is, you're moving towards Hegel, right? Because what is missing, at least from what I understood in Kant, is precisely this developmental story from respect as self-affirmation to unconditioned respect for the moral law, that gap is something which has to be reconciled. And, so the reconciliation between humiliation and respect and so on are all versions of that gap, right? And in Kant, the sort of ladder is missing through which, but you suggested that when you said that, we move from forms of respect which are just self-validation, for example. I thought that was like a sublime sentence in your presentation, to respect as the unconditioned, the recognition of the unconditioned both in you and in the moral law, right? That's where the reconciliation, as it were, happens. And Kant says this when he says, respect the humanity in you, right? And then, therefore, the prevention of self-harm and suicide and so on is all based on this unconditioned in you, which is not you, right? I mean, it's not just merely subjective. So that's the sort of fulcrum through which these opposites are reconciled. But there's no developmental story there, as Hegel has it. So would you kind of agree with that, or would you?
Yes, but while listening to Apar's talk, I realized that I've not been sensitive enough to the question of what's the human. I've been just going between the human and the pure self. But the notion of a rational being is what I've not been sensitive enough to. Like, just what is a finite rational being? For instance, at one point, I just presumed that the finite rational being is a sensibly affected reason. That's not a fair assumption on my part. So I feel that, yeah, it works. Like, that story works in this very anthropological shape that I ended up giving it without really thinking, and I'm then missing the story of what Kant really means by a rational being. And so, because what that makes me think is that we kind of know the Hegelian story, or like he always spots this gap, and it's always provided through the social aspect of reason. But it's sort of making me think literally right now, so I don't have any great thoughts on this, is that the third critiques, which I always see as kind of a new first critique, he is taking that question up again of just what I mean by reason that can be finite or it can be sensibly made. It has that, what Professor McLaughlin's will kind of talk about how it's the life of the mind that's the object to see over there. That gives you a completely different sense of, and maybe even closer to Hegel actually, but gives you a different sense of how to think of which are the two players in this. So in response, yes, that's kind of what I was doing, and that's the Hegelian short, quick story. But it might be actually missing what Kant's view of the life of the mind as transcendental philosophy is, as not just anthropology with bells and whistles.
Yeah, Professor Meghant, this is the last question.
Thank you for your presentation. I was just trying to get into this conversation that you had on humiliation and respect. In the course of your presentation, you had mentioned that in a way, this humiliation is also a way of rising above. There is that elevation, as you put it, rising above self-conceit, rising above self-love, and so forth. So isn't that a way of attempting to find a common ground with humanity, which is what one is doing when one enters into the domain of respect? And the use of the word feeling, how would you look at the notion of feeling here? Why does he still insist on using the term feeling? Because I read it as a way of negotiating that tension between the empirical and the transcendental. And also the attempt to think of ourselves, as Nishad puts it, going beyond myself, to think of humanity itself, which is the whole point of his moral philosophy.
So again, core issues that doesn't seem to give answers to. It's that same developmental question of how does self-conceit which strikes down automatically in some form generate this higher ideal, right? And the kinds of explanations that he gives, this very Aristotelian Hobbesian notion of it removes an impediment and therefore furthers causality, and that is what freedom is, which then one can feed into the idea of humanity as a full-blown use of one's unrestricted use of freedom. But I'm not very happy with that answer, right? And I'm not sure he is, because in the third critique, he is looking for another way to fund the pleasurable aspect through the idea of the sublime, right? And the other way that he had, where it was not this kind of controversial notion of freedom for him directly, because that's sometimes Baumgarten, held on to it, and those were the fights, and like somebody like Corey Van Dyke very nicely lays it out. So it just seems implausible that he would just return to that view. The other ones where he tries to do it is through this idea of taking the natural look at happiness that can be developed through a rational use of self-love and using that. But then the whole idea of humiliation goes on that one. If I just say that there's a way that a natural self-love, which I have in basic self-realization, etc., can be built out towards a regulated self-love that avoids conceit, then I don't have the work of conceit. So what I was therefore trying with this kind of flimsy attempt at the idea of directionality in the end is because orientation, if his analogies with the way that his orientation talks about that I kind of already, it's not like I first have the idea of left and then I have the idea of right and then above and then beyond. I have these at once, right? So I was looking for building up that analog from that little hint. I'm not sure how, and that's where I'll have to kind of leave it. But I went so long, I forgot your second part of your question. Because one was about the conceit part, and then you were tracking back to something that Nishad said.
We are looking at a shared part. We are turning to the idea of respect is to look at shared humanity, to engage with.
Right, and that comes back that even Apaar's talk that sort of really made me. It struck me down that I didn't really even think of how to distinguish humanity and rationality over here, and so that way through a kind of a shared social venture, that's like even it's the same thing in Hobbes, the idea of consensus as a contingent development of shared views or something like that, and Kant rejects that, and so he can't be again creeping back a form of it by saying through my this infinite progress through good works in my everyday life and through creating modesty and humility in a rather than humiliation will just allow me to develop this shared space and the humanity ideal. I think he's unrelenting on that rift between the absolute ideal of respect and so I'm just looking for another way to go than that one. Although I'm sure there's more there than just the hint of directionality at this point.
Okay, great. I think we did well. We started at 10:25 and it's exactly 12:25. Wow. 2 hours. Thank you so much for your participation and wonderful comments. Really enjoyed the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your valuable insights. We will now